Hi, my name is Ophi YouTube Videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things here. Lately, as you can tell by the sign on my wall, I have been on a bit of a kick talking about abortion and various abortion rights ballot initiatives across the United States here in America. That's because our election is 5 days away as of the time I'm recording this, which is scarier than Halloween. Shout out to my lovely Nuance Corner friends who are not in the United States of America, because I might be pretty bummed by this many videos in a row that are really not relevant. I would not be following the United States presidential election this closely if I did not have to live here. But I do, and I'm kind of nervous. In today's video, rather than talking about how to vote in favor of abortion access, I would like to talk about what Project 2025 says in terms of abortion access as well as gay and trans rights. And I mean, Project 2025 is pretty ubiquitous at this point. I don't feel a need to explain what Project 2025 is much more than I feel a need to explain who Donald Trump is. This is a piece of his campaign that I honestly thought was going to fly under the radar for most anybody but pretty involved leftists, and that ended up becoming a centerpiece, especially once Kamala Harris took the nomination after Joe Biden stepped back on my birthday, July 21st. So while I don't feel a ton of need to spend a bunch of time digging into exactly what Project 2025 is, I did find a quick little summary from Vox. An initiative put together last year by the right-wing Heritage Foundation to plan for the next GOP administration. It was shaped by longtime close allies of Trump. Detailed planning for a second Trump term agenda along these lines is very real, and though the Project 2025 initiative itself has seemingly fizzled out, other groups have picked up the slack. Furthermore, many of Project 2025's key proposals to centralize presidential power, crack down on unauthorized immigrants, deprioritize fighting climate change, and eliminate the Department of Education are fully and openly supported by Trump. Yet Trump's intentions are less clear on a vitally important issue where Project 2025 made some particularly extreme proposals: abortion. The project plan called for using the presidential power to aggressively restrict abortions in several ways. Trump, wary of these proposals' unpopularity, has said during the campaign that he won't support some of them. He also evidently feels hesitant to outright disavow the social conservatives who have long been a key part of his base. Harris, meanwhile, wants to associate Trump with the most extreme version of the conservative anti-abortion agenda. Understand in his Project 2025 that there would be a national abortion ban, she said at the debate. That isn't strictly true, in that the project does not call for any explicit ban, but it does include a proposal that some experts say could lead to a backdoor abortion ban, depending on how it is implemented. Furthermore, it is certainly true that anti-abortion activists got key appointments in Trump's administration last time and expect to score such appointments again. At the moment, Trump is caught between his fear of electoral defeat if he backs social conservatives' unpopular ideas and his desire to reward their loyalty to him and keep them by his side. That explains Trump's delicate dance in which he says Project 2025 has some absolutely ridiculous and abysmal ideas, but never quite specifies what those bad ideas are, since doing so might make his supporters angry. And Donald Trump is not a man who should get to have it both ways on abortion. He thinks it was a beautiful thing that Roe v. Wade was overturned by Supreme Court justices that he appointed, multiple of whom swore that they believed that Roe was settled law and that they would not overturn it. But Trump is proud of himself for the fact that it was then overturned. I've been really relieved at how much Kamala Harris has been kind of hammering into all of this. She's really branded it as Trump abortion bans, something that Donald Trump tries to wriggle out from underneath, but that I think is a pretty, not just politically savvy, but also accurate way to word these. And even without Kamala branding it for him the way that she has, Trump has gotten in trouble a few times for his refusal to name his beliefs on abortion throughout his career. Maybe most famously when he had to backtrack after saying that there had to be some sort of consequences for the mother in an abortion, when he flew a little bit too close to the sun, I think, though I'm unsure that that's even something that he'd really still need to pussyfoot around with how intense some of these bans are. So I will admit, I did not read the entire Project 2025 document. It is almost 1,000 pages, and it's the kind of information that I wanted to process via people who already had more knowledge in their head to synthesize it with than I do, so I read a lot of articles, and I'm reading from a lot of them to you today. So according to this article from Gottmacher, which I am going to be pulling from a lot, they have a very helpful fact sheet about Project 2025, proposes several strategies for restricting and ultimately eliminating access to mifepristone, an extremely safe and effective medication used in the most common regimen for medication abortion in the United States. They also want to enforce unnecessary restriction on medication abortion. Things that we've already spoken about in my other recent videos on the subject, requiring in-person appointments, and then only letting licensed doctors do those appointments and prescribe medication, making the patient only take the medication in the presence of the licensed doctor, and eventually making it impossible for the prescriber to even prescribe that medication at all, but making it as difficult as they can before it is impossible. Another thing that making medication abortions happen in person with a doctor does is it slows down the amount of time that somebody can get in. It overcrowds the clinic. They now have to house all of these appointments and schedule them and book the doctor for them, and it slows down the time in which somebody could go and get a procedural abortion if they needed one. And if that all wasn't already enough, they don't just want to restrict medication abortion, they want to entirely revoke the FDA approval of mifepristone, which would take the drug off of the market. For an idea of what a big deal that is, nearly 2/3 of all abortions provided by clinicians are medication abortions, and the vast majority of them use the combined regimen of mifepristone and misoprostol. Although use of misoprostol alone is also safe and effective, it is unclear how widely this regimen would be offered by providers or taken up by patients if mifepristone was no longer available. Further, Project 2025 suggests that a hostile administration could bypass the FDA and effectively ban medication abortion, and potentially all abortions, through enforcement of the Comstock Act, an 1873 anti-obscenity law that prohibits mailing anything intended for producing abortion. The law could be used to prevent the distribution of medication and supplies needed for abortion care, and, if applied broadly, it could result in a nationwide total abortion ban. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. I would like to go over some of the other things listed here as ways that Project 2025 seeks to dismantle United States abortion access. For example, they call on Congress to codify into law the Hyde and Weldon Amendments, harmful policies that limit access to abortion care in the United States by restricting the use of federal funds for abortion care and coverage. It also proposes a full audit of Hyde compliance, including reviewing Biden administration executive actions and Medicaid-managed care in, quote, pro-abortion states, end quote. These investigations may suggest an intention to retaliate against states where state Medicaid funds are used, entirely legally, to provide abortion care. In reality, the documented violations of the Hyde Amendment involve the opposite, states refusing to cover abortion care under circumstances where Medicaid coverage is mandated. Project 2025 calls for the Department of Health and Human Services to dismantle the abortion protections provided under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, EMTALA, a federal policy that outlines requirements for emergency departments that receive Medicare funds. The plan recommends rescinding Biden administration guidance from 2022, stating that people needing abortion care as part of emergency treatment are entitled to that care under federal law, even in states where abortion is banned. It would also ban investigations into cases where patients' rights were violated by denial of necessary emergency abortion care. Wait, hang on a second, because I thought that I was told that the Democrats don't care about abortion and that President Biden did nothing to codify abortion following Roe versus Wade falling, right? Wasn't that true? That's what everyone tells me. What was this guidance from 2022 and how have they remained consistent on it? Let's look into that before we keep going, because I feel like it might make my position of get Republicans out and get Democrats in even clearer than it already is, if you also did not hear about this. We're going to hop back over to Project 2025 in just a moment, but first let's look into this guidance from the Biden administration about emergency abortion. So the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade on June 24th of 2022. And then following that decision, this last summer, 2024, they were unable to conclusively decide an answer to another question, whether or not an abortion should be granted in cases of genuine medical emergency. Again, this article is from July, from the AP. The Biden administration told emergency room doctors they must perform emergency abortions when necessary to save a pregnant woman's health, following last week's Supreme Court ruling that failed to settle a legal dispute over whether state abortion bans override a federal law requiring doctors to provide stabilizing treatment. In a letter being sent Tuesday to doctor and hospital associations, Health and Human Services Secretary Javier Becerra and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Director Chiquita Brooks-LaSure reminded hospitals of their legal duty to offer stabilizing treatment, which could include abortions. A copy of the letter was obtained by the Associated Press. No pregnant woman or her family should have to even begin to worry that she could be denied the treatment she needs to stabilize her emergency medical condition in the emergency room, the letter said. It continued, and yet we have heard story after story describing the experiences of pregnant women presenting to hospital emergency departments with emergency medical conditions and being turned away because medical providers were uncertain about what treatment they were permitted to provide. This letter is the Biden administration's latest attempt to raise awareness about a 40-year-old federal law that requires almost all emergency rooms, any that receive Medicare dollars, to provide stabilizing treatment for patients in a medical emergency. When hospitals turn away patients or refuse to provide that care, they are subject to federal investigations, hefty fines, and loss of Medicare funding. The Texas Alliance for Life responded to the letter by saying that the Biden administration, quote, falsely suggests that Idaho and other state pro-life laws fail to protect women facing life-threatening emergencies during pregnancy. This is untrue, the anti-abortion group said in a statement. All state pro-life laws provide an abortion exception for those rare but tragic circumstances in which a pregnancy poses a threat to a mother's life, including circumstances where death is not imminent. Those include Texas and Ohio. End quote. The emergency room is the last place that the Democratic White House has argued it can federally require rare emergency abortions to be performed, despite strict state abortion bans. After Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 and United States women lost the constitutional right to an abortion, HHS quickly sent letters to doctors, saying that they were required to provide abortions in emergency medical situations when they were needed to keep a woman medically stable. An AP investigation found that complaints about pregnant women being turned away from emergency rooms spiked in 2022 after the United States Supreme Court overturned Roe, raising concerns about emergency pregnancy care in states that have enacted strict abortion laws. In Idaho, enforcement of the federal law in emergency abortion cases had been on hold since January, when the state's strict abortion ban took effect. Idaho's state law threatens doctors with prison sentences if they perform an abortion, with an exception only if a pregnant woman's life, not her health, is at risk. The Biden administration has argued that this conflicts with a federal law called the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, or EMTALA. Roughly 50,000 women every year develop serious pregnancy complications, like blood loss, sepsis, or organ loss. Some of those women may show up in emergency rooms, and in the most serious cases, where a fetus is unlikely to be viable, doctors may recommend a termination of the pregnancy. For example, if a woman's water breaks during the second trimester, a condition known as preterm premature rupture of the membranes, the fetus may not be viable, and continuing that pregnancy means that the patient may risk developing sepsis, an infection that can be deadly. The HHS has also sought in recent months to make it easier for any patient who is turned away or not appropriately transferred to file complaints against hospitals. Earlier this year, CMS unveiled a new webpage that allows anyone to submit a complaint in a straightforward 3-step process. We will continue to build on our recent actions to educate the public about their rights to emergency medical care and to help support efforts of hospitals and healthcare professionals to meet their obligations under EMTALA, the letter said. All right. That is something to definitely keep in our pocket. While it feels like Democrats have not done enough to protect abortion, this is an extremely massive guidance to risk rolling back under a new Trump administration. And it's also a guidance that, as evidenced by what we just read and heard, does not solve the problem in its entirety. However, when so many people who need access to abortion are dying as a result of that lack of access, I think we're not in a position to start pulling off any band-aids before we're ready, least of all the one that's currently letting emergency room doctors operate in their patients' best interest. But like I said, I want to continue with Project 2025. So let's talk a bit about that EMTALA, because it's also mentioned in that article that I've already been pulling from. Further, it seeks to eliminate injunctions against states that have violated EMTALA and recommends that the Department of Justice withdraw from all ongoing litigation where it is currently defending the right to emergency abortion care. Refusal to enforce EMTALA's protections for abortion care puts pregnant people's lives in jeopardy by forcing providers to risk criminal charges if they perform potentially life-saving abortion care. And you know what? I'm going to just keep going. Let's just keep going. Project 2025 aims to implement a broad anti-sexual and reproductive health and rights agenda across the government, including by changing the mandate of key agencies and rewording policies to stigmatize and delegitimize sexual and reproductive health terms and concepts. The plan proposes changing the Department of Health and Human Services into the Department of Life, complete with an anti-abortion task force to replace the existing reproductive health care task force, and a newly created position of Special Representative for Domestic Women's Health to lead anti-abortion policy efforts across agencies. It recommends deleting all terms related to gender, gender equality, reproductive health, reproductive rights, abortion, sexual orientation, and gender identity from all legislation, federal rules, agency regulations, contracts, agency websites, and grants. Likewise, it encourages the use of U.S. influence at the United Nations to remove language, quote, promoting abortion, end quote, from UN documents, policy statements, and technical literature. Project 2025 uses charged, medically inaccurate anti-abortion rhetoric, including language falsely portraying abortion as unsafe, to break down support for abortion rights and bolster efforts to criminalize providers, misuse laws and regulations meant to protect against discrimination, and ultimately cut off access to abortion care. The agenda also uses the false implication that abortion is unsafe to justify proposals to increase pregnancy and abortion surveillance at the federal level. The plan suggests mandated reporting of abortions, as well as miscarriages and stillbirths by all states, using denial of federal funding streams as a means of enforcement. The potential weaponization of this data collection by a hostile administration poses an immediate threat to abortion providers and patients, and it paves the way for increased criminalization of pregnancy outcomes other than abortion. And it doesn't end here, of course. Project 2025 also seeks to redefine basic sexual health education as pornography, and then to make pornography illegal, and also recommends replacing comprehensive sex education with abstinence-only curricula. You know, the kind of sex education curriculum that leads to an increase in birth rates, especially teen birth rates. That kind of abstinence-only sex education. And this also is far from the only attack on education in Project 2025, though I'm not really covering that angle of it here as much. The Republican agenda to attack the education system is very well known at this point if you've been anywhere near the States, or even just remember the name Betsy DeVos. Project 2025, also, I think, predictably for Republicans, calls for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, to encourage states to eliminate all Planned Parenthood facilities from their state Medicaid programs, as some states have attempted in the past. It also suggests that CMS create a new regulation that would disqualify abortion providers nationwide. This would have disastrous effects on access to basic health care services, particularly family planning, with other safety net providers unable to increase their capacity to fill the gap that would be left if federal funding were pulled from Planned Parenthood and other reproductive health providers. The agenda also makes baseless claims that some states are violating the Weldon Amendment by requiring coverage of abortion care in private insurance plans. Project 2025 calls for withdrawing partial Medicaid funds from these states in retaliation, a weaponization of funding that provides crucial health insurance for people with low incomes. So, I'd like to talk about something that I think gets lost and hidden in a lot of this abortion and pro-forced birth rhetoric that nobody is truly allowed to address, which is that a lot of this is done so that they can steal babies. A lot of pro-forced birth plans make a lot more sense once you move away from, well, how do they expect somebody who's on state insurance and can't afford an abortion to afford a baby when they're refusing to provide any kind of support for families or children and trying to gut the existing programs every chance they get, and into, oh, it's because it's actually ideal if the potential abortion patient doesn't have the money to keep the baby and then also doesn't get to have an abortion. There are some pro-life protesters who give the game away a bit with all of this, standing outside of abortion clinics with those "will adopt your baby" signs that they may or may not ever intend on making good on the offer of. But they enjoy, in theory, the concept of adopting this brand new baby. And I mean, some of them actually do. I'm not going to pretend like people don't go through with adoption for other reasons and that those adoptions cannot be a positive thing. I'm sure that there are plenty of genuinely happy stories of biological mothers who did not want to abort and who gave their baby to people who wanted a baby. And then that baby had a beautiful and happy life. But I also know about a lot of adopted children who have spoken about dealing with the trauma of being separated from their birth family, often from their culture, from people who experience life more closely to the way that they do than the people who adopted them. Like every system in the United States, our adoption and foster care system, but I'm not a YouTuber who is particularly qualified to give much of a rundown about that. I just, listen when people speak. Inherent flaws in the adoption industry aside, it becomes pretty clear to me that the purpose of a lot of this is to funnel brand new babies into that industry. That's who these evangelical families want, the kids who don't have memories of who they might grow up missing, who are blank slates for them to project Christian nationalism onto. If someone who can't raise a baby is forced to have a baby, some white bread evangelical Christian couple with one mother and one father are more than happy to raise that baby in their own image. And I'm going to say this in a heartless way because it is how these people operate. If the mother dies in labor, then, well, the adoption agreement just got a little bit less complicated, huh? Also, to be flippant to prove a point, if you've been listening about these attacks on abortion and thinking to yourself anything like, fuck, this is horrifying, but at least I'm on birth control and at least a pregnancy likely wouldn't get far enough for me to need to worry about this, I'm very sorry to break this to you, bestie, but nobody's safe. You also should be worried about this. Even just regular contraception is under threat here. The Heritage Foundation is very into that whole Hobby Lobby type of thing where just you can restrict the parts of healthcare you have to cover for your employees based on your whims and religion. In addition, the plan calls for broadening the contraceptive coverage guarantees existing religious and moral exemptions to make it easier for any employer, including large for-profit corporations, to exclude contraceptive coverage from their employees' health plan. Such exemptions deny people reproductive autonomy and access to needed health care, while over a decade of evidence shows that the coverage guarantee reduced patients' costs and helped them to use the birth control method of their choice and to use it effectively. I've talked about this a bit before on my channel, particularly I think in my video about Girl Defined. I was raised very religious. I'm talking homeschooled the whole way through, so I wouldn't learn about evolution in school, only left the house to go to church, got baptized as a child, and then confirmed as a teenager, and then baptized again as a teenager in case it would help with the whole gay thing, and it didn't because my lesbianism is very waterproof. I was very religious as a child. And I am not any longer. That's probably pretty clear from my content. I've definitely called myself an atheist here before. I was raised among a lot of other families like my family, families who homeschooled to protect their children from the outside influence of the world. A lot of those families all participated in a co-op because their children got to socialize with each other instead of just living on permanent house arrest, and a handful of those families were what are known as quiverful families. I think you probably already know what a quiverful is, or at least you will if you're not already familiar with the word, but I said, like 19 kids and counting. None of the families I knew had quite that many kids. There definitely were some double-digit families, and it was definitely out of the feeling that there was this heavenly mandate that God himself would decide the amount of children you should have, and you should have all of the ones he wants you to have. But people on the right subscribe to natalism for a lot of reasons, and it isn't always as straightforward as that quiverful reasoning, where they convince themselves that birth control or anything other than, like, natural family planning is a sin. There are also people who aren't seemingly doing it for religious motivations, like Elon Musk, for example, who has gotten extremely into this. And he's into the making babies part more so than the trying to steal other people's babies part. He's providing sperm for lots of babies for other people to do the work of raising. Not really in with the whole two-parent nuclear thing that he's really into. But I read this article from Politico that my bestie sent me about a far-right natalist rally that these sorts of freaks attended. And I thought it was really horrifying, and I thought it felt kind of relevant here. Most of the first day of the conference is spent defining the problem. In a nutshell, sperm counts are historically low. Our bodies are full of microplastics. Public schools are indoctrinating children against the good Christian values with which they were raised. Dating apps have gamified romance, tricking lonely singles into believing that a better prospect is always around the corner. Women have been convinced that they can have it all, kids and a career and endless vacations and so much more, only to end up unhappy, infertile, and alone. The speakers who lay out this bleak state of affair are a motley crew of the extremely online right, many of whom go by their X, the website formerly called Twitter, handles rather than their names. Via Zoom, anonymous Twitter user Raw Egg Nationalist warns us about indoctrined disruptors in everything from perfume to bottled water. Bren Braddock, an editor at the conservative magazine IM776, claims that antidepressants and birth control pills have permanent detrimental effects on women's fertility. Together, the speakers paint a dire picture of a society that has lost its way, abandoning fundamental biological truths and dooming itself to annihilation in the process. The solution, of course, is to have more babies. Peachy Keenan, a synonymous writer affiliated with the conservative Claremont Institute, urges attendees to, quote, seize the means of reproduction, end quote, as in to outbreed liberals who are already hobbling their movement by choosing to have just a couple children or none at all. Quote, we can use their visceral hatred of big families to our advantage, Keenan says. The other side is not reproducing. The antinatalists are sterilizing themselves, end quote. Here lies the project, spelled out in detail. The people who disagree have bloodlines that are slowly going to die out. To speed up that process, to have this particular strain of conservative natalist ideology become dominant quickly in the United States, everyone in this room has to have more kids, and fast. But it's only when the speakers get to who should have babies and how they should raise them that their deeper concerns and the larger anxieties behind this conference become clear. The goal, as put by Indian Bronson, the synonymous co-founder of the elite matchmaking service Keeper, is more better people. But the speakers lack consensus on the meaning of the word better, as they do on the subject of using technology to encourage the best and brightest among us to breed. Keenan, who has previously celebrated her sense that it is now acceptable to say, quote, white genocide is real, end quote, says better means conservative. Pat Fagan, the director of the Marriage and Religion Institute at the Catholic University of America, says good children are the result of stable, two-parent Christian households, away from the corrupting influences of public school and sex ed. Christian couples, he adds, have, quote, the best, most orgasmic sex, end quote, citing no research or studies to support this. To protect these households, we must abolish no-fault divorce, declares Britt Benjamin, a lawyer with waist-length curly red hair. Until relatively recently, Benjamin was married to Patry Friedman, grandson of economist Milton Friedman, the founder of the Seasteading Institute, a Peter Thiel-backed effort to build new libertarian enclaves at sea, and to ensure that these children grow up to be adults who understand their proper place in both the family and the larger social order. We need to oust women from the workforce and reinstitute male-only spaces, quote, where women are disadvantaged as a result, end quote. Shampoo magnate and aspiring warlord Charles Haywood says, prompting cheers from the men in the audience. The full article is horrifying and a really, really good read. I highly recommend it. My bestie called all of this just eugenics with a twist when we were talking about it, and I agree. The twist being that it's not just about having your own babies, but also about producing a supply of other babies to take and remove from their own culture, even when that culture is still within the United States. A domestic supply of infants, actually, which is phrasing from Sentient Bag of Slime and Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. He cited it. I'm going to read from a Slate article from not long after the Dobbs ruling. One of the most arresting lines in Justice Samuel Alito's 98-page draft opinion reversing Roe v. Wade is a footnote that didn't really surface until the weekend. A throwaway footnote on page 34 of the draft cites data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention showing that in 2002, nearly 1 million women were seeking to adopt children. Quote, whereas the domestic supply of infants relinquished at birth or within the first month of life and available to be adopted has become virtually non-existent. End quote. In response to the outrage and some misinformation, the conservative legal industrial complex went to great lengths to downplay it as a trivial footnote in a draft opinion and to insist that Alito was citing the CDC and not himself, and that the note appears in a roundup of people are saying type arguments against abortion. True, but the footnote reflects something profoundly wrong with the new ethos of care arguments advanced by Republicans who want to emphasize compassion instead of cruelty after the Dobbs versus Jackson women's health fallout. Footnote 46, quantifying the supply-demand mismatch of babies, follows directly on another footnote in the opinion approvingly citing the logic raised at oral argument in December by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who mused that there is no meaningful hardship in conscripting women to remain pregnant and deliver babies in 2022 because safe haven laws allow them to drop those unwanted babies off at the fire station for other parents to adopt. Second only to the creeping chatter of state birth control bans, the speedy pivot to celebrating forced birth and adoption is chilling. It's chilling not just because it discounts the extortionate emotional and financial costs of childbirth and the increased medical risks of forced childbirth. It's chilling because it lifts us out of a discussion about privacy and bodily autonomy into a regime in which babies are a commodity and pregnant people are vessels in which to incubate them. If this sounds like a familiar, albeit noxious, economic concept, it's because it is. This article from Dahlia Lithwick, as well as a few other arguments from other legal scholars, including Michelle Goodwin, who was cited in a Georgia judge's ruling that was very briefly used to overturn their abortion ban, connects reproductive care access to the amendments in the United States Constitution that had to do with ending slavery, making the argument that the rights that were granted to all citizens of the United States clearly spell out that a person must have the right to determine what happens with their own body and their own pregnancy. The state Supreme Court reinstated the Georgia abortion ban like a week later, but this was still a pretty enormous win, and an argument that I personally find solid, but that I, again, don't feel like the right YouTuber to be making that argument in a video, both as a white woman who is able to talk about abortion without invoking slavery, and as somebody who didn't take a real civics class in my life and doesn't find it as easy to learn enough about the Constitution to present that information as she does about current laws right now. So, much like the issues present within the adoption industry, I am just going to say that I am aware of that being a larger conversation, that you should read the Slate article and especially the post from Michelle Goodwin that I have linked in the description below. And I'm going to move back to that original article that we were reading about Project 2025. In addition to the other restrictions on abortion providers, like we discussed earlier, it says, the plan proposes reinstating the harmful domestic gag rule, which would prohibit healthcare providers who receive Title X funding from providing abortion referrals and would require them to be physically and financially separated from any abortion-related activities, including counseling. Within about a year of this policy going into effect in 2019, before it was rescinded in 2021, hundreds of clinics left the program, and the number of patients dropped by 2.4 million. Project 2025 goes further and recommends legislation that would prohibit Title X funding from going to entities that perform or help fund abortion care. Legislating such a policy makes it harder to reverse in the future, compared with administrative rulemaking. It would also disqualify providers who meet the gag rule's already stringent requirements. Project 2025 also seeks to leverage U.S. influence to undermine sexual and reproductive health and rights globally, including by cutting United States financial support to countries and initiatives. It proposes immediately reinstating the global gag rule, which would prevent non-U.S. non-government organizations from receiving U.S. government global health assistance if they used their own non-U.S. funds to provide abortion services, information, counseling, referrals, or advocacy. Past iterations of the rule have detrimentally impacted reproductive health outcomes, systems, and services by decreasing access to contraceptive services and leading to clinic closures. Project 2025 wants to take the policy further and have it apply to all U.S. foreign assistance, including humanitarian aid. The plan also proposes blocking funding to the United States Population Fund, UNFPA, which provides a wide range of critical sexual and reproductive health services to women and girls globally. When funding to UNFPA was withheld by the Trump-Pence administration, it caused a significant disruption to service delivery. Project 2025 wants to impose its anti-trans rights ideology at the United Nations, too. It suggests expanding on the Trump-Pence's administration's Geneva Consensus Declaration on Women's Health and Protection of the Family, an anti-rights, anti-abortion, anti-gender joint statement that undermines human rights, although that declaration was non-binding and was never adopted by the UN. And I do want to talk a little bit more about the anti-gay and anti-trans rhetoric portion of all of this. I've said before how I believe that these struggles are fundamentally entwined, that it all comes down to bodily autonomy. Project 2025 features plans for all kinds of communities, and they are awful and truly detrimental plans. I read from a few different sources while I was researching for this part, but my favorite actually was from Teen Vogue, of all places. They've actually had some really good coverage over the last few years about some things, and this one is called, "Here's How Project 2025 Could Decimate LGBTQ+ Rights." Under the banner of Restoring the Family, Project 2025 aims to gut protections for the LGBTQ+ community, whose marriage and family rights are seen as opposed to the project's religious tenets. The project urges policymakers to elevate, quote, family authority, formation, and cohesion as their top priority, and even use government power, including through the tax code, end quote, in order to restore the American family. The project falsely claims that, quote, family policies and programs under President Biden's Health and Human Services are fraught with agenda items focusing on LGBTQ+ equality, subsidizing single motherhood, disincentivizing work, and penalizing marriage. These policies should be repealed and replaced by policies that support the formation of stable married nuclear families. Among the project's false claims is that heterosexual two-parent families are safer for children, which presents an open opportunity to attack LGBTQ+ marriage. Research prepared by the American Sociological Association concluded that there is a clear consensus in the social science literature indicating that American children living within same-sex parent households fare just as well as those children residing within different sex parent households over a wide array of well-being measures. While nothing in the document explicitly ends for ending the right to same-sex marriage, Gillian Brenstetter, a communication strategist at the ACLU's Women's Rights Project and LGBTQ+ and HIV Project, told The Nation that it does indirectly call, quote, for treating same-sex marriages as second-class marriages, end quote. The document indirectly states support for a biblically based definition of family, and by gutting policies that protect LGBTQ people, like supporting adoption agencies that refuse to allow same-sex couples to adopt, or rescinding workplace protections based on sexual orientation, would significantly erode the rights of queer couples across the board. There's a reason I was mentioning straight and Christian couples being the ones to adopt these potential overflow babies, because they will be the only ones still allowed to adopt. Gay parents already face systemic discrimination when they try to adopt, and while gay parents in the adoption system aren't exempt from the criticisms that exist of the system, this is really not a place where we want to roll back equal rights and protections. Is it, Jojo?
Yeah? Come say so. What do you think? The cord is not long enough, baby.
Of course, marriage and family rights aren't the only thing being threatened under Project 2025. The plan advocates for deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, SOGI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, gender, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term used to deprive Americans of their First Amendment rights out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists, end quote. This could erase LGBTQ people from federal protections entirely, seemingly attempting to write them out of existence. The plan calls for changes to Title VII, rolling back hiring and firing protections that were run in the landmark Bostock versus Clayton County case, which understood sex discrimination as including gender identity, and that LGBTQ+ people were protected from workplace discrimination and termination. Sex discrimination, according to the project, would be restricted to a biological binary meaning, or simply male and female. Some of the project's most extreme positions are against transgender people. The project recommends cutting federal funding for gender-affirming care for both minors and adults, echoing policy goals of both Trump and other right-wing political figures. Project 2025 seeks to revisit the Biden administration's edict that transgender minors have a right to gender-affirming care. The plan describes a social contagion that leads to gender-affirming care for youth and calls for the National Institutes of Health, NIH, to fund research exploring the negative effects, quoted, of gender-affirming care, be it social or medical affirmation. And to be clear, Donald Trump has not attempted to distance himself from these plans for the gay and trans community the way that he has tap danced around his abortion promises. He's said a lot of this transphobic shit himself directly and made a lot of similar promises in videos. And he's consistently surrounding himself with people who spew hateful and vile anti-trans and anti-gay rhetoric, who have only increased the absolute insanity of what this man gets away with saying out loud. Haven't they, JoJo?
Yeah?
And I really, truly wish that the Democratic Party was prouder of being the party that is supposed to give a shit about trans rights. It does sometimes make it into a speech or a tweet by future Vice President Tim Walz, but it really isn't nearly enough of a centerpiece of this campaign, and nothing like the way that reproductive rights have been centered in Kamala's speeches. Like, I wish that I got to vote for the Kamala is for they, them, that is described in those awful Republican ads. I wish that she would come out very forcefully in support of the trans community. There are a lot of things that I wish that she would be more forceful on, and a lot of things that I wish that she would be less forceful on. But we are right up about to the end of the Kamala Harris campaign for president, and as terrified as I am that I might be wrong, and knowing that I am putting a timestamp up where people will laugh at me in a week if I am, I think she's gonna win.
Yeah? Do you think she's gonna win? Thank you. Thank you for my kissy.
That doesn't mean I'm not still deeply filled with political anxiety. I am. It's why I'm sitting here right now. I don't know what happens after that. I don't know what Mike Johnson and Donald Trump are trying to work out behind the scenes, and I don't know how long it will take for the final results to be in, because I think we probably won't have them on Tuesday. I think Trump is going to drag it out for a really long time, even once we do have those results, but I think she's gonna win. And Kamala Harris winning will not defang the threat of things like Project 2025. It does not promise that there will be no Project 2028, 32, and so on. It does not remove the corruption and money and bigotry that is seeped into every aspect of electoral politics. Because that shit is coming from the floorboards. But it does give us someone who has not made promises to walk back trans rights. It gives us somebody who served in the Biden administration, which has not been perfect on trans rights, but which has given trans people a lot of protections that they either did not have before or were explicitly stripped of during the Trump administration. And Kamala has not made any promises to break from those standards. Someone who has been campaigning on reproductive rights and who, like Biden, does need a Democratic majority in the Congress to be able to make good on that. There is still more work to do, and there always will be more work to do. But there will be more room to do that work under Kamala Harris. If you're eligible to vote in the United States, please do, and please vote to make sure that Donald Trump does not get a chance to put any of this into action. Thank you so much for watching. I know a lot of people have skipped out on the last handful of videos because they're already stressed out enough about the electoral reality of everything, and I completely understand. I already said it, but I would be too if I didn't have to live here. If you do find these videos helpful, I'd appreciate it if you consider maybe liking the video. And if this is your first time here, hi, welcome to the Nuance Corner. Maybe consider subscribing. I am not always electoral brained. I'm usually here talking about more pop culture sort of topics. And also, especially since these last few videos have not done super well in the algorithm, thank you so much to my lovely Patreon subscribers, especially to Jem and Jess, who support me at the producer tier. If you're interested in a couple more videos from me a month, or in a way to toss a little money my way and help support me financially, the Patreon is a great option to do that. I also have a Ko-fi if you just want to make a one-off donation. All of that is a huge, enormous help to me financially. I do this like full time, not because I am super confident in myself. I mean, I'm getting there. I'm way better at making videos than I was a year ago, but because I'm chronically ill and too disabled to work. I was up very late last night scripting this and really, really hoping that I would feel well enough to record it before the election. And yay, I did. I've recorded like pretty much all of these recent videos in the middle of the night. It's like 5 p.m. right now, which is very early for me to have started and finished actually, recording. I will be back soon. I'm not sure if it will be before the election. That depends on how the next couple of days look for me. But I love you very much. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to be okay. I think we're going to be okay. Please do whatever you can. If there's a way you can spend 10 minutes waiting in line to vote to be a little more okay than we would be if the guy who wants to do all of this wins. Thank you. I love you.